This is LaRouche Pack's Saturday evening class series. Tonight's class is the vital importance of Dante for the MAGA movement. Uh, my name's Tony Papert, but the presenter tonight is Robert Ingraham, well known to some of you, the author of 8 published books. So, many of you come into tonight's presentation with many other things on your mind. There's tremendous, in my opinion, very justified worry among Americans about the outbreak of a large war centered in the Mideast. We're in the midst of an economic breakdown crisis in our country. We're at a historical turning point in a situation which may make or break the United States of America over roughly the coming year. But we're asking you to look at that from a different standpoint for the moment, that of Dante with Robert Ingraham. So Bob, take it away.
Okay. Hi, folks. As Tony said, the title, sort of the title overall of this class series is why is Dante important today for the MAGA movement? And, that's worth thinking about. Most people today know very little about Dante. He was born in 1262 and died in 1321. So he lived more than 700 years ago. He lived, in a medieval society, which almost no one today really can relate to. He wrote the Divine Comedy, or the Commedia in its original title, which really not a whole lot of people today have read in its entirety. The comedy, has 3 parts of, hell, purgatory, and paradise, which are not particularly hot topics, in social media or in the MAGA movement. So it seems somewhat far removed. So, the question is, why is Dante relevant? Why is this important? Now, we're going to spend the next 3 weeks discussing Dante. The class tonight is The Crisis of Dante's Time. Next week, we're going to delve into some of Dante's poetry, but most of the class next week is going to be devoted to the Divine Comedy. And then the third class is on creating the Renaissance, which will deal a lot with what happened after Dante died, leading into the Renaissance. Now, in terms of why this is relevant, I would sort of ask people to think about it, in the following way. Dante died in 1321. And then, as some people know, in the 14th century, actually beginning in 1347, only about 25 years after Dante's death, the Black Plague struck Italy and struck all of Europe. It lasted for a number of years. There are varying estimates as to how many people died. It's my view that, the death toll was probably close to 50% of the entire European population. In Florence, which was Dante's birthplace, between 2/3 and 3/4 of the population died. Now, you want to talk about a crisis, you want to talk about a catastrophe. Imagine, the city you live in today, and all of the surrounding cities, and all of the surrounding countryside and suburbs and everything else, suffering a death rate of 50% or even up to 75%. This was cataclysmic. This was a civilizational crisis of enormous proportions. Yet less than 75 years later, after the plague had struck, less than 75 years later, in 1420, Filippo Brunelleschi began the construction of the Dome of Florence, of the Cathedral of the Santa Maria del Fiore, the well-known Dome of Florence, which we'll show a picture of in one of the upcoming classes. And that construction of that dome was the greatest scientific accomplishment, the greatest scientific achievement of the Renaissance. And it was accompanied by an explosion of breakthroughs in art, in science, in human creativity. And this is only 2 generations after half to 2/3 of the population had been wiped out. How did that happen? How did you go from that extremity of a crisis, of collapse, and all the barbarity which was associated with it? How did you go from that to this explosion of human creativity within 2 generations? Now, some people today will say, well, the crisis, forced people to reevaluate everything they believed in, to reevaluate their deepest held, what you could call axiomatic beliefs, that there was a revolution in thinking, that's how some people explain it. And, there is partial truth in that, because a crisis does cause people. If you're in a society that's where everything is breaking down, it causes people to re-examine what they believed in. We see that today. We see it with the MAGA movement, with people all over the country today who are becoming politically active, who never would have thought they would be politically active, who are speaking in public, who are doing things that they never would have imagined that they would do, 5 or 10 years ago. So a crisis does cause this kind of, response from the population, but it doesn't necessarily lead to a renaissance. And in fact, if you look at the history of the human species, and I'm not going to go into examples of this, but if you look at the history of the human species, most, collapses of civilizations, where civilizations were destroyed, were followed by a prolonged dark age, which would last centuries or longer. Some areas never recovered. So what happened in the creation of the Renaissance was something singular, something unique, something profound and wondrous. And given the crisis we're in today, if you think not just about the day-to-day political battles that we're in, but if you think about what it is we need to create, how we're going to move into the future, this question of Dante and the Renaissance, I insist, is of profound relevance to the situation we find ourselves in today. Now, to move into the subject of the class tonight, we're not going to start with Dante, and we're not going to start with the Renaissance. I mean, as I said, there's 3 parts to this, so people need to be a little bit patient. I'm not going to talk about the Divine Comedy tonight, and that will be next week. What we're going to begin with is we're going to look at the crisis in Dante's times, the crisis that preceded the Black Death. and we're going to look also at Dante's life. You know, Dante did not start writing the Commedia till he was, I don't know, 40, 45, I think about 45 years old. So, one thing to ask yourself is, what the hell was he doing up to the age of 45? What was his life really all about? And hopefully we'll get through some of that tonight. Now, look, people think people know very little about medieval history, and that's understandable, other than college professors who specialize in this area. But a lot of people are under the impression that this was all just sort of a dark age, medieval times, but the reality is quite different. It's a dynamic period, and particularly in the century and a half leading up to Dante's birth. If you look at the 12th century, the first half of the 13th century, Europe, in fact, experienced an enormous amount of economic progress, including a great deal of new technology and the improvements of the productivity of society. This included things like water wheels, windmills, the building of canals, improvements in mining, in agriculture, in shipbuilding, in tool making. There was enormous progress in these areas. Now, some of the new technology came from the Arab world. Some of it had its original origin in China, but not all of it. There were improvements and great leaps that were being made in Europe. If you look at the period between 1100 and 1250, for instance, the number of water wheels, which are wheels powered by water, from which you can do all kinds of grinding and leather making and all kinds of things. These were being used all the way down into the 19th century. In 1100, there were only a couple of dozen water wheels in all of Europe. By 1300, there were more than 15,000 water wheels. This is enormous leaps in economic productivity and in progress. Improvements in skill levels in the population. The population was becoming more skilled, as the technology developed. And if you look at Europe between 1100 and 1250, the population rose from 58 million in 1100 to 79 million in 1250. That's an increase of 36%. So the economy was moving forward, the population was growing. There was also the critical development of urbanization. In that same period, 1100 to 1250, the number of cities and towns rose from only about 100 to more than 1,000. So you had the development of cities, which became the basis for commerce and also education and a lot of other things. The point I am making is that Dante was not born into a dark age. And in fact, it was the economic progress and the optimism generated by that economic progress which really made Dante possible, as well as certain other people he was associated with, like Giotto di Bondone, who was the great artist and architect, who was an intimate friend of Dante and lived roughly around the same time. They came out of a society which had been experiencing, real progress. Okay, now, however, there was a countervailing tendency. And this is what directly led into the crisis that unfolded during Dante's adult years. What began to emerge in the early to mid 13th century, say 1200 to 1250, was the emergence of something called Lombard banking. And these were these huge private banking houses controlled by families or family banks. But they emerged in a whole slew of cities in northern Italy, including Florence, Lucca, Milan, Genoa, and other cities. The Venetian Empire also played a major role in this. At that time, later the Venetians got into banking. At that time, Venice wasn't really a center of banking, but the Venetian Empire controlled the trade and supply in both silver and gold, which gave them a controlling role in this whole banking operation. Now, during the 13th century, the Lombard bankers established a vast system of usury and debt, high interest loans. And this spread not only across, Italy, but it spread all over Europe. The Lombard bankers became the bankers of Europe. And, the various noble houses, the rulers of England, France, Spain, all of these German principalities and dukedoms and what have you, all of these, ruling class families borrowed heavily from the Lombard bankers and became trapped in a web of debt payment and usury. This was also true for people involved in commerce and manufacturing, where essentially everything within society became dominated by a financial usurious system, which is by no means identical, but bears a certain resemblance to sort of where we find ourselves today. Production was being strangled. Nations were being bankrupted. And one of the things that occurred as a result of this wasn't the only thing, but one of the things that occurred was that, kings and other, aristocratic ruling families, in order to meet their debt payments, began to impose, massive taxes on the population. Unbelievable heavy tax burdens, staggering taxes to meet their debt obligations. The economy began to collapse. Now, this was also intersected by, and if you read a lot of histories, too much emphasis, in my view, is put on this, but it was intersected by a change in climate. Because at that time in the 13th century, Europe was moving from what was called the medieval warming period of higher than average temperatures, which had existed for a couple of hundred years. The weather was cooling down. The warming period was ending. The winters were longer and harsher. The summers were rainier. And this exacerbated the crisis. If you read many histories, they'll tell you that the collapse leading into the Black Death was, largely the result of climate change, which was real, not man-made climate change, but actual climate change. But in fact, the climate change just exacerbated the collapse, which was primarily caused by this usurious system of debt that was bankrupting and strangling nations. Farms went fallow, agricultural production collapsed, woolen production collapsed, food disappeared in many areas. By 1290, and this is when Dante's 28 years old, by 1290, population in Europe began to decline. which was the first time in more than 300 years that the population had begun to decline by the end of the 13th century. Cities and towns began to be abandoned. Whole regions began to be depopulated. Famine spread. So this is the crisis that is hitting full force, as Dante enters adulthood, that in which he begins to become, a public figure. Dante was first elected to government. I had the exact year here, but I took it out for some reason. He was elected to government in the 1290s when he was in his 20s. He was first elected to government just as this crisis is destroying the fabric of society in Italy and throughout the rest of Europe. Now, Dante, and we'll get more into this next week, but Dante, in his writings, blames much of the crisis that Europe is in. In fact, as the prime, cause, the prime culprit, he blames much of this crisis on the usurious banking system that had developed at that time. He actually identifies in the Paradiso the introduction of the gold florin in 1252, because the gold florin, the florin was the currency of Florence, and the gold florin became sort of the currency of record. You could call it the reserve currency. That's probably not exactly technically accurate, but it became more or less the reserve currency of all of Europe. All of the banking houses in the Lombard League, their assets were held in gold florins. This became the basis for trade, for loans, for everything else. The private banking houses, the Bardi, the Peruzzi, the Frescobaldi, and others, the entire financial system run out of Northern Europe was based on this gold florin. I'll just say right here that if you in reading the three books of the Commedia, the Purgatory, the Inferno, the Purgatory, and Paradise, it is just somewhat stunning how frequently Dante returns to attacks on this usurious financial system, and particularly his particular anger is focused against the Vatican, the papacy, for their massive involvement in this, in this financial corruption, and he returns to it over and over and over again. Now, you also had during this period the real not emergence, but the growth in power of the Venetian Empire during the 13th century. This sort of was in tandem with the development of the Lombard League. In 1202, Venice had financed and led the Fourth Crusade. But the Fourth Crusade, which was supposedly a crusade to liberate, the Holy Land, Jerusalem and the Holy Land, never got to the Holy Land. Instead, under Venetian direction, the Venetians paid for all the boats, they paid for all the soldiers and everything else. Under Venetian direction, the crusade sailed to Constantinople, which was a Christian city, and looted Constantinople. They captured the city and looted it, and basically broke the power of the Byzantine Empire. And this led towards, in the 13th century, a massive expansion of the Venetian Empire, because the Byzantine Empire had been their primary competitor, and they were, broken. And Venice gained all these colonies. They gained unprecedented expansion, unprecedented expansion of their trade to the east and trade throughout the Mediterranean, and really emerged as the dominant empire in the Mediterranean by the end of the 13th century. Now, a third major development in this, leading into this crisis of Dante's lifetime, was occurred a little later, while Dante was still alive. In 1309, the papacy moved its headquarters from Rome to Avignon, the city of Avignon. Now, Avignon today is in France, but in 1309, it was not in France. It was in something called the Kingdom of Arles, which was technically part of the Holy Roman Empire, one of these autonomous kingdoms within the Holy Roman Empire. And the Kingdom of Arles was under the control of the House of Anjou, who also controlled the Kingdom of Naples. And this is part of the Angevin. The House of Anjou is, part of what was called the Angevin dynasty or family, which controlled many of the hereditary monarchies in Europe at that time. It was, the Angevins who moved into England and established what were called the Plantagenet dynasty in England, which Shakespeare spent a lot of time analyzing and dissecting. With the movement of the papacy into Avignon, the Avignon became sort of the northern outpost of the Lombard League, and Avignon became a center with the papacy, incestuously involved in it. Avignon became the center of corrupt finance and corrupt banking during this period, which is what Dante sets his sights against. So you have this, this crisis, which is hitting, in which the population is already beginning to decline. And this is long before the Black Death. The population is already beginning to decline. Cities are disappearing. People are starving. And you have this combination of Lombard banking, the corrupt papacy, the Venetians, the Angevin rulers, who essentially represent a financial and oligarchical, nobility, which is looting and destroying Italy and destroying Europe. Actually, why don't we put up the first three slides, if we can, Tony? I meant to put the first two up in the beginning. I just want to explain a little bit about them. Yeah, the purpose of these, this is not, I'm not going to go into these things, but to give you some sense of what Europe looked like at that point. I mean, there's no real nations. The Holy Roman Empire is a confederation of, numerous principalities, dukedoms, and what have you, all of which have their own little local aristocracy and what have you. Italy's not a nation. You have the Kingdom of Sicily there, which is run by the House of Anjou. France is not really a nation. None of these are really nation states at all. If you look at England and then look directly south of England, you notice they're the same color, the western part of France. That's because at that time, they were ruled by the same monarch, one of these Angevins, one of the House of Plantagenet kings. It's there's no such thing as a sovereign nation in Europe at this point. So put up the next slide. Yeah, and this is just to give you a sense of Italy. And I think this is actually not a picture of Italy at the time of Dante's life. I think this is about 100 or 200 years later. But that doesn't matter that much, because the idea of the picture is to just give you a sense that Italy is comprised of just a multitude of city-states, little principalities, oligarchical families fighting each other. The green is the papal states. That's the area directly under papal control, which I think was a little bit different geographically when Dante was alive, but you get the idea. You have Florence there, in the red circle. That's the purple. That's Tuscany, where Florence is, and Venice up in the up in the upper right. But it's a pretty chaotic situation as it existed. All right, that's enough of that. So put up the next slide. Now, there's a reason why I'm putting this up, which is that if you notice, all of these pictures, I think, which are painted shortly after Dante's death or sometime back then. If you look at all these pictures, you notice that Dante is wearing a wreath of laurel leaves, bay laurel leaves. And in 3 of the 4 pictures, he's holding a book. And, to the extent people have an image in their mind of Dante today, it generally resembles one of these pictures, And again, if you talk about what is the relevance of this discussion, if you look at one of these pictures, how do you make that relevant to your life? Because, you look at it and it's like, oh, he's this dreamy sort of poet, walks around with leaves on his head, and this is not to attack the artists. The artists probably love Dante and were trying to do him, portray him in an honorable way. But in terms of the effect on people today, here's this guy, walking around with leaves on his head, holding a book, like some kind of, dreamy poet, and this sort of thing. And that's not who Dante was. Dante was a warrior. His entire life was a life of combat. He didn't sit around in some ivory tower, and just, write poetry or that's not who he was. From the moment he entered politics when he was in his 20s until the day he died, he was involved in combat. And that's what we're going to get into next. So you can take that down, Tony. All right. So I'm going to have to try to run through this a little bit quickly. Look, at the time that Dante was born, most of the cities in northern Italy were divided and were involved in ongoing political and often bloody warfare between 2 factions. Now, it got fairly messy, and it doesn't always work out precisely this way, but more or less, there were 2 factions in most cities. In Florence and a lot of these other cities. These were called the Guelph faction and the Ghibelline faction. Now, the Guelph faction was allied with the papacy. But in reality, by the time, Dante is alive, and, it's not just the papacy. It is this papal, Venetian, Angevin, oligarchical power, financial and otherwise oligarchical power behind the Guelph faction. The other party, the Ghibellines, were allied with the Holy Roman Empire and the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, because traditionally, if you go back into medieval times, northern Italy, down to really almost to Rome, except for Venice, which was never part of it, but northern Italy was part of the Holy Roman Empire. Now they had lost that, but nevertheless, these cities were gripped by this ongoing battle between the Guelph faction loyal to the Pope and the Ghibelline faction loyal to the Holy Roman Empire. Now, in Florence, the Ghibellines were overthrown in 1267, and then they suffered, a devastating defeat in 1289, at which point Florence came under the rule of the Guelph faction. Now, the Guelphs then very quickly, over a number of years, themselves split into two factions. The white Guelphs, who were called the Bianchi, and the black Guelphs, the Neri. The black Guelphs were sort of hardcore, loyal to the Pope, and the white Guelphs were more moderate. Dante, whose family had traditionally been part of the Guelph party, when Dante came into public life, he joined the white Guelph faction, became the leader of the white Guelphs. By the time he was in his mid-30s, he was the leader of the white party, the white Guelph party in Florence, and he became a dominant figure in the Florentine government. He was elected to something called the Council of 100 in 1295 when he was 33 years old, and then later that same year elected to the Council of 36, which was a more elite group, and then in 1300 he became one of the 6 ruling priors of Florence, which is the ruling group. And in fact, he was, for all practical purposes, the civilian head of the Florentine government, by 1300. In fact, Boccaccio says in his life of Dante, Boccaccio says that by 1301, nothing was done in Florence without Dante being consulted. So that's who Dante was. He was the head of the Florentine government in 1301. Now, what happened was that in 1301, the Pope made a deal with Charles of Valois, who was the son of the French king, to attack Florence and to militarily occupy Florence, which they did. They captured the city. And many of the white Guelph leaders were killed. There was widespread killings that went on as the black Guelphs were put back into power. Dante, who was in Rome at the time, was accused in absentia and charged with bribery, trafficking in offices, and other crimes, and he was found guilty. He was banished for 2 years. He was permanently excluded from office. And then 2 months later, in a subsequent ruling, the Florentine authorities condemned Dante to be burnt to death if he ever re-entered the city of Florence or fell into the hands anywhere of Florentine officials. So he was condemned to death in 1301. He fled Rome and he went into exile. He never again set foot in Florence. He lived in exile for the remainder of his life. And just sort of one sort of humorous note here is, in 1301, Dante was condemned to death by the Florentine government, and that death sentence was not officially lifted by the government of Florence until the year 2008. So it took them a while to get around to it. So after his banishment and after he went into exile, he devoted the next 3 years of his life. When I say he was a warrior, he devoted the next 3 years of his life to raising an army to reconquer Florence. He went from city to city to city to city, and he pulled together an alliance of the white Guelphs and the Ghibellines, and overcame their differences and pulled together an alliance of white Guelphs and Ghibellines, and they formed an army. And in 1304, they attacked Florence to recapture the city with Dante in attendance. He was not commanding the army. He was not a military leader, but he was there when the attack occurred. Unfortunately, the army, the white Guelph Ghibelline army, suffered a massive defeat. And it was crushed, and it dispersed. At that point, Dante fled, and he spent the next 3 years traveling the countryside alone. The way Boccaccio puts it is, he says, Dante became a party unto himself. He traveled to a number of cities, including Bologna, Padua, and all over the place. Things got worse. The Pope, who had been alive at that time, Boniface, died, and he was replaced by a new Pope, Clement V, who was even worse. And it was under Clement V that the Pope moved the headquarters of the Catholic Church from Rome to Avignon, in the Kingdom of Arles. Dante, during this period, 1304, 1305, 1306, is traveling around. He has no home. He's in exile. And then, and in fact, one of the things he begins writing at this point, and this is something I'm going to talk about in the third class, is a work called the Convivio. I'm not going to talk about it tonight, except to give you one quote. But he's writing this while he's, moving from city to city. And in fact, he never finished it. And you can understand why. But in the Convivio, during this time when he's, on the run, he wrote in the Convivio, quote, this is Dante, quote, I have gone about as a beggar, showing against my will the wound of fortune. Verily, I have been a ship without sails and without rudder, driven to various harbors and shores by the parching wind. And he had spent almost 5 years, traveling around from city to city, no money, on the run. If the Florentine or papal forces had caught him, because the papal forces would have sent him back to Florence, he would have been executed, and what have you. But then something happened. In 1309, a new emperor was crowned of the Holy Roman Empire. This was Henry VII of Luxembourg. And he immediately announces that he is going to reassert the historic control of northern Italy by the Holy Roman Empire. He's going to bring it back into or under the control of the Holy Roman Empire. And he forms an army and he invades Italy. Dante immediately rushes to his side. And Dante spends the next 3 years with Henry VII. During this time, he becomes the propagandist for Henry's army. He writes a series of open letters, which circulate. He writes quite a few of these, which circulate all over northern Italy. These are what are called the epistolae, I believe, if that's the correct pronunciation. Essentially epistles. They're open letters, which he writes to the people of northern Italy, calling upon them to come to to rally to the cause of Henry of Luxembourg. And he writes one of these, which he directs, directs directly to Henry, in which he urges Henry to immediately march upon Florence and to seize control of Florence. Or what he says, seize, quote, the most wicked Florentines within the city, unquote. He also writes other epistles, open letters, condemning the Pope Clement V for financial corruption, for political treachery, and and this goes on. Henry's army captures a number of cities: Genoa, Vicenza, Pisa. Dante is by his side. There's nothing written about the relationship between the two men, but Dante is with the leadership of the army. And then he tries to capture Florence. He can't. He puts a siege on Florence, but then eventually abandons the siege because he realizes he doesn't have the troop strength necessary to take the city. So he continues marching south. His aim is to take Rome. He takes the city of Siena, but then as he approaches Rome, there's a battle that takes place. It's not worth going into it, and during this battle, Henry VII dies. He wasn't killed in battle. He dies of malaria. But, this is the emperor. This is the head of the imperial army. And he dies. And at that point, the whole invasion collapses. Most of the troops march back north to Germany, which is where they had come from. The rest of it just sort of dissipates and disappears. And the whole scheme falls. And at that point, Dante flees again, and these years are even more obscure. For the next 2 years, no one really knows where he was. Boccaccio writes about this, and he says that during those months, and we're talking about 2 years, Boccaccio says that during those months, Dante's steps are lost in darkness. He's wandering around, a political refugee, because of the epistles that he had written, his open letters, and because of really the premier role he had played in Florence as the head of the Florentine government. He really is public enemy number one of the papacy of the Black Wealth Party. He is, in 1315, the papal vicar of Tuscany. Now, Tuscany is the province where Florence is located, and the papal vicar is the representative of the Pope. The Pope's personal representative in Tuscany. And in 1315, the papal vicar of Tuscany condemned Dante and his sons to be beheaded if they were captured. In 1316, the new Black Wealth government of Florence declared a general amnesty for all of their political opponents, but Dante alone was excluded from the amnesty. He was not granted amnesty. Other white Guelphs, Ghibellines were granted amnesty. Dante is excluded. Instead, the papal victory condemns him to death to be beheaded. So things looked, not good, to say the least. What happened is that essentially Dante was rescued in 1315. He was invited to come to I think it was Verona. Yeah, I think it was Verona. I hope I have the city right. He was invited to come to Verona by the ruler of that city, a man by the name of Congrande della Congrande della Scala. Yeah, he was the ruler of Verona, and Dante went to Verona, and under the protection of Della Scala, he lived there for 3 years, protected, and it was while he was in Verona that he wrote De Monarchia, and he began to work on the Paradiso. He had already written, during all of this turmoil of everything I just described to you, he had already written the Inferno and the Purgatorio. And by the time he gets to Verona, the Purgatorio, and this is when he's condemned to be beheaded, not only are his epistles circulating, but the first copies of the Inferno and the Purgatorio are also beginning to circulate through northern Italy. But while he's in Verona, he writes De Monarchia and writes the Paradiso. So you want to put up the picture of Congrande, Tony? This is Congrande della Scala. And doesn't look like a warrior, but he was a warrior. And put up the next picture. And this is just a picture of his, I think his palace or one of the buildings. I think this was his palace in Verona, where Della Scala lived. Just to show it to you, that's all. You could take it down. Della Scala was a Ghibelline, and he was a fierce opponent of the papacy, the Black Wealth Party, and he fought dozens of battles over a period of decades, military battles, very fierce in warfare. And he protected Dante for 3 years. Dante writes glowingly about him. And he also was a champion of the art. He brought Giotto to Verona to be with Dante. And Giotto and Dante lived together in Verona under Della Scala's leadership, protection. Now, as I said, he writes while he's in Verona, he writes De Monarchia. Now, I want to talk a little bit about De Monarchia. I'm going to go over here, folks, but I'm not going to cut this short, so bear with me. He for those, most people who are on the call tonight have never read De Monarchia. But I will tell you that if you read about it, like if you go to Wikipedia or you read what these, professors write about De Monarchia, most of what is said about it is just not true. It's just garbage. And I mean that literally. What they try to say is that De Monarchia is a defense of imperial rule. That that Dante is supporting the German Empire, the Holy Roman Empire, the Holy Roman Emperor Henry VII. That Dante is a champion of imperial rule, and then also Dante in De Monarchia talks glowingly about Rome. So this just proves that he's this champion of imperial rule. And if you want to get even more ludicrous, I mean, some of these people say that in northern Italy you had the beginnings of the development of civilian government or republics, and Dante was took the side of the empire against the Italian republics or what have you. I mean, this is just lunacy. You have to be on LSD to believe something like that, because there were no republics in Italy. These were all oligarchical states, all of them. And the most ludicrous example is they talk about the Venetian Republic. I mean, Venice was the most avaricious, brutal empire throughout the Middle Ages. There was no republic; it was the Venetian Empire. So, what you read about De Monarchia is just nonsense. But what he's really talking about in De Monarchia is he's talking about how to organize society. How should nations and society be governed? And what he's talking about, what he's investigating, are the principles upon which society should be governed and organized. And I'm going to read you a couple of quotes from De Monarchia, 3 short quotes to give you a sense of it. In the introduction, he says the following, quote, "All men on whom the higher nature has stamped the love of truth should especially concern themselves in laboring for posterity, in order that future generations may be enriched by their efforts, as they themselves were enriched by the efforts of generations past. For that man who is imbued with public teachings, but cares not to contribute something to the public good, is far in arrears of his duty. Let him be assured he is indeed not a tree planted by the rivers of water that bringeth forth his fruit, but rather a destructive whirlpool, always engulfing and never giving back what it has devoured." So posterity, contributing to others, contributing to the future of society. This is what he's examining of the principles that have to be the bedrock of a civilized society, of any nation state or other political entity. In chapter 2 of De Monarchia is entitled, "To What End Does Government Exist Among All Men?" To what end does government exist among all men? And in that chapter, he says, "Since the matter under consideration is governmental, nay, is the very source and first principle of right governments, and since everything governmental is subject to our control, it is clear that our present theme is primarily adapted for action rather than for speculation. So if there exists an end for universal government among men, that end will be the basic principle through which all things to be proved hereafter may be demonstrated satisfactorily. And then in chapter 4, he says, it has thus been sufficiently set forth that the proper work of the human race, taken as a whole, is to set in action the whole capacity of that understanding which is capable of development, first in the way of speculation, and then by its extension in the way of action. So what he investigates is the question of human creativity to create a better society and a more productive society, and for human individuals to contribute towards that progress, as the basis for human society. I mean, these are revolutionary ideas, believe me. If you think back to, what existed at that time with these oligarchical rulers who just ruled by whim and arbitrary decisions and what have you. One of the things he takes up in De Monarchia and spends quite a bit of time talking about is the personality of Cincinnatus, the famous Roman citizen who in time of crisis was called forth by the Roman people to lead Rome. He left his farm, was essentially given dictatorial powers to lead the Roman army to defend Rome from being destroyed by a foreign enemy. Led the Roman army in battle, was successful, and then at the end of the campaign, he gave back his powers voluntarily and returned to his farm, to his plow.
You want me to put up that picture, Bob?
Yeah, I'm running over, but go ahead.
It's the statue of Cincinnatus in Cincinnati. Of course, it's named after him.
Yeah, Cincinnati. Yeah. So you see in his right hand, that's what's called the fasces. That's what was given to him, giving him dictatorial power over Rome. And that's in his right hand. And in his left hand, he's holding a plow. And this is at the end of his service after he defeated the foreign enemy. And he's handing back, the power of, the executive power, the fasces. He's handing that back to the Roman people. And he's grasping his plow, which he is now going to be returning to. And Dante spends a great deal of time talking about him. And he spends a great deal of time in this discussion of Cincinnatus on the subject of free will, of voluntaristic free will, that is inherent in every human being. And he says that animals do not really possess free will, that they're governed by their appetites, but that man is free to develop his intellectual powers, his goodness, and to develop the society within which he lives. And in chapter 12 of De Monarchia, he says, it is therefore again manifest that this liberty, or this principle of our liberty, is the greatest gift bestowed by God on mankind. By it alone, we gain happiness as men. But if this is so, who will say that humankind is not in its best state when it can most use this principle? Right? So, this is not, De Monarchia is not a writing about a form of government. What kind of form of government are we going to have? That's not what it's about, despite what your college professor might tell you. It's a writing about, what are the principles of government? And those principles of government have to flow from truthful principles about what it means to be human, about human free will, about doing good in society. This is what he's getting at, the nature of the human identity. I could tell you that De Monarchia 1317 is really Dante's declaration of war against the oligarchy, against oligarchical powers, and what LaRouche called the oligarchical principle, that the oligarchical principle rules society. And Dante says, no, it doesn't. There's something else, which is truthful and legitimate based on the nature of what it means to be human. And De Monarchia was, to give you one sense of it, shortly after Dante's death, a number of Catholic Church officials began trying to gather up and seize all copies of it. One of them was a papal representative in Rimini, who declared De Monarchia to be a pestilent a pestilent poison, and condemned it. In Bologna, which was a city under Black Guelph control, they searched every house, every building in the city, and seized every copy of it they could find and burned them in the public square. Such was the danger of Dante's ideas to the oligarchy of his time. So, to sort of bring this to a close, we'll follow Dante's final journey. In 1317, he left Verona. Why he left Verona, I don't know. I have no idea, but he left Verona at one time. And as Boccaccio puts it, he became a man without a city, and he departed. This is a quote from Boccaccio. He departed to Romagna, where his last day that was to put an end to all his toils awaited him. Romagna is on the Adriatic coast. It's actually where Cesare Borgia fought a lot of his battles a couple hundred years later. But Romagna is on the Adriatic coast. It's part of the Papal States. So this is an area, each city has its own ruler. And most of these cities are under Black Guelph control. But Dante, fled into the Romagna, and traveled around. Again, I don't know why he left Verona, but he traveled around, and in a very dangerous situation. But he was rescued once again. In January of 1318, so I guess Dante had been traveling around in the Romagna. He'd been traveling around for, 6 months, 9 months, whatever. But in January of 1318, the ruler of Ravenna, a man by the name of Guido Novello de Polenta, heard of Dante's trouble, heard that he was in peril. So he sent an emissary inviting Dante to Ravenna, and that he could live in Ravenna under his protection, which Dante accepted and then went there. And Boccaccio writes about this. So Boccaccio says, when it came to da Polenta's ears that Dante, beyond all expectation, was now in Romagna, and in a desperate plight, he who had long time before known his worth by fame resolved to rescue him and do him honor, nor did he wait to be request such favors, but he approached Dante and requested from Dante a special grace, that which he knew Dante must needs have begged of him, to wit, well, I probably butchered that, but to wit, that it might please him to abide with him. So da Polenta had heard of this plight and sent an emissary to invite Dante. And why don't you put up this final picture? Okay, now this is a picture you see of three people. On the left is the ruler of the one sitting down, is the ruler of Ravenna, Guido Novella da Polenta. On his, in the center is Dante, dressed in red. He's dressed in red in a lot of these paintings. And then next to Dante is Giotto, who, went to Ravenna with Dante. Giotto and Dante were together a lot at various times. And they are being received by da Polenta in this painting. You could take that down. Now, in Ravenna, Dante completed the Paradiso, the final book of the comedy. And it's sort of funny, not funny, but telling that as he completed individual cantos, he sent them by messenger to Can Grande della Scala at Verona. Canto by canto, he would send to Can Grande. So he had not left, Verona because there was a falling out any means. Boccaccio says that Dante held Can Grande della Scala, quote, in reverence among all other men. So these two individuals, Can Grande della Scala and Guido Novella da Polenta, neither of whom are hardly known at all today, have the great undying honor of having rescued Dante, in two separate places. And then as the cantos from the Paradise are flowing forth from Dante as he's writing them, under da Polenta's protection, he's sending them immediately to Can Grande della Scala as a gift. In 1321, the Venetian Empire formed an alliance with the city of Forli, Forli was under the control of the Black Guelph Party. And in 1321, Venice formed an alliance with the city of Forli with the intention of invading Ravenna, of killing the whole da Polenta family, murdering them, and annexing Ravenna to the Venetian Empire. At that point, da Polenta asked Dante to head a political mission to go to Venice to try to head off this invasion, to negotiate a peace between Venice and Ravenna. So Dante, sets off and goes to Venice for these negotiations. The Venetian Doge and the members of the Venetian government refuse to meet with him. He's frozen out. And then while he's in Venice, he becomes very, very ill. Now, people speculate that he was poisoned or murdered by the Venetians. I don't know. I mean, the Venetians are certainly evil enough to do that, but there's no evidence that actually was what happened. What is known for sure is that he became very ill in Venice. And what also is known for sure is that at the point he becomes very ill, he requested from the Venetians to be allowed to take a ship back to Ravenna, because even if you owned the boat or hired the boat, you could not sail from a Venetian port unless you had official, permission to do that. So he requests permission to take a boat back to Ravenna, and they refuse. They refuse to give him permission. So his diplomatic mission had collapsed. There was no reason to stay there, and he was extremely ill. So he had to travel back to Ravenna by land, and it was a very arduous and difficult route. And by the time he arrived back in Ravenna, he was extremely ill, and after that was in September of 1321, and 2 days after he returned to Ravenna, he died. He was buried in Ravenna. Florence likes to claim him today as their guy. But there were several efforts that were made by the government of Florence and the Italian government to move Dante's remains from Ravenna to Florence, all of which were unsuccessful. He remains to this day buried in Ravenna, the city that gave him protection and where he wrote the Paradiso. In his life of Dante, Boccaccio says this about Florence. He says, in place of reward, he suffered an unjust and hasty sentence, perpetual banishment, the alienation of his family, and if that could have been accomplished, the staining of his glorious fame by false accusation. To this, the fresh traces of his flight, his bones buried in another country, his children scattered in others' houses, all bear witness. If all the other iniquities of Florence could be concealed from the all-seeing eyes of God, would not this alone suffice to draw down upon her his wrath? Yea, verily. So, that's really what I have to report tonight, folks. I mean, some people may have found this a little dry in terms of historical detail, but as I've said, as we go into the Divine Comedy and the beauty and profoundness of it, I don't want to give people the idea that Dante is just some airy-fairy poet living up in a tower somewhere writing this verse. His last mission was a political mission to stop an invasion of Ravenna by Venice. He fought for 3 years at the side of the German Emperor Henry VII. In De Monarchia, he defines the philosophical and moral basis for human government. This is who he is. So that's what I wanted to cover tonight. So a little long presentation, but let's open it up.